In 1990, China's gross fixed capital formation, the share of output reinvested into factories, roads, ports and productive capacity, stood at roughly 35% of GDP. India's was 26%. By 2022, China's had peaked and stabilised near 43%. India's had reached 31%. That 9-point gap from 1990 became a 12-point gap over 3 decades of India supposedly closing in. The World Bank has published both figures annually. Neither number appears in the standard narrative about India's rise. What capital formation measures concretely is how much of an economy's output it turns back into the physical and institutional capacity to produce more output. A country that consistently reinvests 43% of what it generates is not just growing faster, it is compounding the conditions for growth at a rate a 31% economy cannot match without a structural intervention, not a trend line. The gap between those two numbers is not a gap in potential. It is a gap in architecture. Manufacturing tells the same story with less room for interpretation. In 1995, manufacturing as a share of GDP was roughly 33% in China and 28% in India, according to World Bank National Accounts data. By 2022, China held at approximately 27%, having absorbed a partial deindustrialisation while remaining the world's factory floor. India's share had fallen to 13%. India did not fail to industrialise at China's pace. India deindustrialised before it finished industrialising. That is a different diagnosis entirely, and the treatment plans are not the same. The infrastructure investment data runs parallel. Between 2000 and 2020, China built roughly 42,000 kilometres of high-speed rail. India built none that meets the international classification for high-speed service, according to the International Union of Railways. China's highway network expanded from roughly 16,000 kilometres of expressway in 1998 to 160,000 by 2020. India's national highway system, not expressways, national highways, covered roughly 145,000 kilometres total by the same year. A figure the Indian Ministry of Road Transport reports with considerable pride, and which becomes considerably less impressive when you adjust for freight capacity, lane count, and surface quality. The ports tell you the same thing. Shanghai handled 47 million 20-foot equivalent units of container traffic in 2022. The Jawaharlal Nehru port in Mumbai, India's largest container port, handled 6.3 million, according to the Indian Ports Association. That is not a gap that closes by adding capacity at current rates. It is a gap that reflects a different order of prior investment decision. None of this is hidden. All of it is in the appendices of reports whose executive summaries describe India as an emerging manufacturing powerhouse. What the mainstream coverage has consistently treated as a gap in execution, India almost there, just needing policy refinement, the underlying data describes as a gap in the structural conditions that make execution possible. A country with 13% manufacturing share, 31% capital formation, 0 kilometres of high-speed rail, and one major container port handling 6 million units is not behind China on a single track. It is on a different track with different physics. The question that follows from those numbers is not whether India can catch up. The question is what catching up would actually require, and whether the institutions currently cheerleading for it have any interest in saying that number out loud. The mechanism starts with a decision made in Beijing in 1978 and one not made in New Delhi for another 15 years. And the distance between those two dates is where the compounding began. China's special economic zones, launched under Deng Xiaoping following the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, were not policy experiments in the conventional sense. They were sovereign carve-outs, territories where labour law, tax structure, land acquisition and foreign ownership rules operated under a completely separate legal regime from the rest of the country. By 1985, Shenzhen's industrial output had grown 40-fold from its 1980 baseline, according to the Shenzhen Statistics Bureau. The zone model then replicated across 14 coastal cities, then inland. The Chinese government was not inviting foreign capital into its economy. It was building parallel economies inside its borders, where foreign capital could operate without encountering the frictions of the main one. India's response to this model arrived in 2005 with the Special Economic Zones Act, 27 years later, and structured differently in ways that matter. Chinese SEZs were government-built, government-infrastructured, and delivered to investors as operating environments. Indian SEZs were largely developer-built, meaning private capital was expected to construct the physical infrastructure before industrial tenants arrived. The land acquisition framework that was supposed to support this collapsed into legal and political dispute within years of the Act's passage. By 2013, the Ministry of Commerce's own data showed that fewer than 40% of formally notified Indian SEZs were operational. The model was adopted. The mechanism that made it work was not. This is where the infrastructure investment gap from Part 1 becomes a policy gap, not just a capital gap. China did not attract manufacturing because it had cheap labour. In the 1980s, labour was cheap across most of Southeast and South Asia. It attracted manufacturing because it built the roads, the ports, the reliable power grids, and the legal predictability around land tenure that allowed a factory to operate at scale without pricing in political risk on every contract. The labour cost was the headline. The infrastructure was the offer. India's power sector illustrates this with uncomfortable precision. In 2014, not 1994, not 1984, but 2014, the World Bank estimated that Indian firms lost an average of 8.8% of annual sales to power outages. The comparable figure for China at the same point was below 1%, according to the World Bank Enterprise Survey data. A manufacturer choosing between two locations does not require a sophisticated model to price that differential. 8.88% of annual sales consumed by generator costs, spoiled inventory, and idle labour is a margin destruction figure. It does not appear in the investment brochures. The foreign direct investment data confirms what the power figures imply. Between 2000 and 2022, China received cumulative FDI inflows of approximately $2.3 trillion, according to UNCTAD. India received approximately $550 billion over the same period. The ratio is not explained by market size alone. China's GDP is roughly 5 times India's, but its FDI intake over that period was roughly 4 times larger, meaning it attracted foreign capital at a higher rate relative to economic size. Capital went where the conditions were built to receive it. What I find harder to dismiss is the timeline of Western enthusiasm for India as a manufacturing alternative. The loudest declarations that India was ready to absorb supply chains relocating from China arrived in 2020, 2021, and 2022, precisely when the geopolitical motivation to believe it became strongest. The infrastructure data did not change in 2020. The capital formation numbers did not change. The port capacity did not change. What changed was that a certain conclusion became strategically convenient, and the analysis adjusted to support it. The Asian Development Bank's 2022 infrastructure report estimated India's infrastructure investment gap, the difference between what it is spending and what it would need to spend to support manufacturing-led growth, at approximately $2.4 trillion through 2030. That figure does not appear in the press releases announcing India's emergence as the next global factory. It lives in the technical annex on page 47, where convenient narratives rarely travel. The strongest case for India's trajectory does not come from the optimists. It comes from the data on what China looked like in 1995. And that case deserves to be taken seriously before it gets dismantled. In 1995, China's per capita income was roughly $600, according to World Bank National Accounts data. Its manufacturing infrastructure was concentrated in coastal zones that represented a fraction of its total landmass. Its banking system carried non-performing loan ratios that the People's Bank of China itself later acknowledged had exceeded 30% in state banks through the late 1990s. Its legal framework for foreign investment was opaque, selectively enforced, and subject to revision without notice. By every conventional metric of institutional readiness, China in 1995 was not obviously better positioned than India in 2023. And yet the 30 years that followed produced the gap documented in Part 1. The argument that follows from this is reasonable. Gaps of this scale have closed before. The conditions that produced China's acceleration were replicable, and India's current reform trajectory, the production-linked incentive schemes, the national infrastructure pipeline, the goods and services tax unification of the domestic market, represents exactly the kind of structural intervention that precedes manufacturing takeoff. This is the steel man. It is not a weak argument. It is the argument made by serious economists at institutions including the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, and Goldman Sachs' Emerging Markets Desk. The problem is the data those arguments rely on and the data they leave out. India's production-linked incentive scheme launched across 14 sectors between 2020 and 2021 with a stated government commitment of approximately $26 billion over 5 years, has produced results that the government's own Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce described in its 2023 report as below target in several key sectors. Electronics PLI, the flagship, the one cited most frequently in the bullish India coverage, saw Apple's contract manufacturers expand assembly operations at facilities in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Those facilities assemble. They do not manufacture components. The semiconductor fabs, the display panel plants, the battery cell production, those remain in China, Taiwan, and South Korea. India moved up one step in a supply chain whose commanding heights it does not control. The National Infrastructure Pipeline, a 111 trillion rupee commitment announced in 2019, had achieved implementation rates the Controller General of Accounts pegged at below 50% of annual targets through 2023 in roads, ports, and urban infrastructure combined. The pipeline exists. The execution rate is the number that matters, and it is the number that does not travel far from the government's own fiscal documents. Now return to the capital formation figure from Part 1. India at 31%. China's acceleration through its critical manufacturing decade, 1995 to 2010, was underwritten by capital formation rates that averaged 41% annually, according to World Bank data. To replicate that trajectory, India would need to sustain a 10 percentage point increase in its investment to GDP ratio for a decade. That requires either a dramatic increase in domestic savings rates, currently around 30% versus China's 50% plus during its peak accumulation years, or a sustained FDI inflow at a scale the current political and infrastructure environment has not demonstrated the capacity to attract. My read on this is that the reform program is real, the intention is genuine, and none of that is sufficient on its own timeline. The PLI scheme addresses output incentives without resolving input constraints. You cannot incentivize a manufacturer into locating where power costs 8.8% of annual sales, where port throughput is 1/7 of your primary competitor, and where land acquisition for a greenfield plant still carries litigation risk that Chinese SEZs eliminated by legal design in 1980. The counter-argument that India is on China's 1995 trajectory assumes that the conditions which allowed China to accelerate from that baseline are transferable. The infrastructure investment gap, $2.4 trillion through 2030, per the Asian Development Bank, is the measure of how untransferred those conditions currently remain. China in 1995 had a 30-year head start on building the thing that made its 1995 to 2025 growth possible. The head start was not the growth, it was the infrastructure for the growth. India does not have a 30-year head start on that. It has a 30-year deficit. Here is what the evidence has built toward, and it requires saying directly. The Western bet on India as a China alternative is not an economic analysis. It is a geopolitical preference dressed in the language of economic analysis. And the dressing is thin enough that the underlying structure shows through when you apply the actual numbers. The capital formation gap is 12 points and widening in the data that matters. The manufacturing share gap is 14 percentage points and structural in its causes. The port capacity ratio is roughly 7-1. The infrastructure investment deficit is $2.4 trillion on a timeline that ends in 2030. These are not lagging indicators of a transition already underway. They are the measurements of a physical reality that investment brochures and geopolitical strategy documents have decided, collectively, to describe as temporary. The Western supply chain diversification away from China is real. The beneficiaries, when you follow the actual FDI and export data, are Vietnam, Mexico, and to a significant degree, through intermediate processing, China itself, which has responded to tariff pressure by routing production through third countries, in a pattern the United States Trade Representative's Office has documented and largely been unable to stop. Vietnam's exports to the United States grew from $49 billion in 2017 to $114 billion in 2023, according to the US Census Bureau. India's grew from $49 billion to $83 billion over the same period. Real growth, but concentrated in pharmaceuticals, gems, and petroleum products, not in the manufactured goods categories that define industrial transition. The semiconductor question crystallizes the verdict. The CHIPS and Science Act allocated $52 billion to domestic US semiconductor manufacturing in 2022. The EU CHIPS Act targeted a similar mobilisation for European capacity. India's Semicon India program announced $10 billion in incentives the same year. Micron Technologies announced a $2.75 billion assembly and testing facility in Gujarat in 2023. Assembly and testing, not fabrication. The leading-edge fabrication capacity, the part of the supply chain that determines who controls the technology, remains in Taiwan and South Korea, with China aggressively building toward it despite export controls. India is not in that race at the level the announcements imply. It is in the race for the lower margin end of a supply chain whose strategic core it does not currently have the infrastructure, the trained workforce pipeline, or the capital formation rate to contest. What this tells me, and I will stake something on it, is that India will grow substantially over the next decade, will attract meaningful manufacturing investment in specific sectors, and will not close the structural gap with China in any time frame that the current Western strategic planning horizon actually covers. The gap is not a policy problem with a policy solution. It is a compounding problem, and compounding works in both directions. Every year that China's capital formation rate exceeds India's by 12 points is another year of physical infrastructure, industrial clustering, and supply chain depth that does not exist on the Indian side of the ledger. The hole does not stay the same size while you look for the shovel. The prediction, stated with enough specificity to be falsifiable, by 2030, India's manufacturing share of GDP will not exceed 17%. It was 13% in 2022. The production-linked incentive schemes, the infrastructure pipeline at current execution rates, and the FDI trajectory at current inflow volumes do not produce a 4 percentage point structural shift in 8 years. If that number reaches 17% by 2030, the mechanism I have described here is wrong, and the optimists were right about something more than the direction. The institutions that have spent 5 years telling you the gap is closing have access to the same World Bank data, the same UNCTAD inflow figures, the same Asian Development Bank infrastructure reports. The question of why the executive summaries read differently from the technical annexes is one those institutions are better positioned to answer than I am. If the data in this series changed how you read the next India investment headline, share it with one person who needs to see the footnotes, not just the press release. The information was always there.